I'm Ted Seides, and this is Capital Allocators. This show is an open exploration of the people and process behind capital allocation. Through conversations with leaders in the money game, we learn how these holders of the keys to the kingdom allocate their time and their capital. You can join our mailing list and access premium content at capitalallocators.com.
All opinions expressed by Ted and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Capital Allocators or their firms. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of Capital Allocators or podcast guests may maintain positions in securities discussed on this podcast.
My guest on today's show is Charles Duhigg, a celebrated writer for The New Yorker and author of bestseller The Power of Habit. His latest book, Supercommunicators, describes how to effectively communicate in conversation. Our conversation covers Charles's path to writing business stories and personal books and turns to his latest tour de force. We discuss the science behind connection, 3 types of conversations, methods to become a better communicator, and tools to navigate challenging conversations. Charles's book and words feel like unlocking a secret language that can help anyone connect better with others. And he embodies the archetype of the supercommunicator he describes. Before we get going, here's a shout out to all the investor relations and business development professionals. Your role is one of the toughest in the industry because unlike in many other industries, the functions of marketing, sales, and customer relations rarely drive purchase decisions in investing. It's often hard to know how to move the ball forward when allocators are busy and opaque about their process. So we decided to create a Capital Allocators University experience just for you. On December 3rd and 4th in New York City, I'll be joined by your peer and superstar Rahul Mudgal, branding expert Jen Prosek, founder of Prosek Partners, conference wizard Ron Biscardi, founder of iConnections, and investment leaders Sarah Samuels from NEPC, Dave Moorhead from Baylor, and Shannon O'Leary from St. Paul, Minnesota Foundation to help you learn best practices for understanding allocators, developing relationships with investors, and building a brand through workshops and peer discussions. You can learn more and sign up to join us at capitalallocators.com/university. Thanks so much for spreading the word about our newest Capital Allocators University course for investor relations and business development professionals. Please enjoy my conversation with Charles Duhigg. Charles, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I would love to hear about your background and path to writing from the very traditional journalistic background of Yale and Harvard Business School.
I have to say, when I graduated from HBS, I was the lowest paid member of my class that was working for the first 6 years. I was an editor on the Daily News when I was at Yale, and then left and I started a company and lived abroad for a little while. And then after starting the company, realized that I really was not great at management, that there was a lot that I needed to learn. So I applied to HBS and I got in and went to business school. And about midway through the first year of business school, we ended up selling the company. So suddenly I had all this freedom. And I spent the summer between first and second year, which, as you know, we usually spend that summer interning at a place and trying to convince them to hire you. I went back to New Mexico, where I'm from, and I spent the summer working for this private equity real estate group. I was trying to decide whether to go into business and politics in New Mexico or become a journalist. And I decided that if I ran for politics and I lost, that my life would feel unsatisfying. Whereas if I went into journalism and it didn't work out as well as I had hoped, it would still be fascinating to me. So I decided to become a journalist. And luckily, it has gone well.
So what became the focus of your journalistic work?
So I always write about business. I really like writing about business. I like stories about business. Business is something that all of us do, and I think it touches our lives in a very visceral way. So a lot of my journalism for the New York Times, now for the New Yorker, is rooted in trying to understand commerce and what capitalism means today. When I started writing books, though, one of the things I discovered is that I can take those same tools and I can apply them to topics that are much more focused on the types of questions that I just had about my life. A decade ago, I wrote this book called The Power of Habit, about the science of habit formation. And it really started with me saying, if I'm so smart and I have all these fancy degrees, why is it so hard for me to go running in the morning? What am I doing wrong that it's hard for me to eat healthily? So I just wanted to understand, what do we know about the neurology of habit formation? And out of that grew this book. And similarly with this book, Supercommunicators, it really started with me recognizing that although I was good at a number of things, I was not as good at communication as I wanted to be. And that was surprising because I'm a professional communicator. I would get in these dumb fights with my wife, or they made me a manager at the New York Times, and I was good at everything except the communication part. So I thought, let me just see what researchers and scientists know about communication. And of course, it turns out we're living through this golden age of understanding communication like never before. So that's how it works.
What did you find when you dove into research on communication?
So the biggest thing that I found is that we are living through this golden age. Because of advances in neural imaging and data collection, we understand what happens inside people's heads when they communicate like never before. And for me, the pattern that I fell into with my wife that led me to this was I would come home from work after a long day and I'd complain about my day to her. And she would very reasonably offer a good suggestion, like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other better? And instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I would get even more upset. And I would say, you're supposed to be on my side. Why aren't you outraged on my behalf? And then she would get upset that I was attacking her. I think everyone literally in a relationship has had this experience. So I went to researchers and I said, what's going on here? Why does this pattern happen again and again? And they said, well, look, here's one of the big things that we've discovered. We tend to think of a discussion as being about one thing. We're talking about our day or our kids' grades or where to go on vacation next year. But actually, every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations. And in general, those conversations tend to fall into one of three buckets. There's these practical conversations where we're talking about making plans or solving problems. But then the second bucket is there's these emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then finally, there's this third bucket of social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other and how we relate to society and the social identities that are important to us. And what they said is, what we now know is that if you are not having the same conversation at the same time, you can't connect with each other. So when I was coming home, I was having an emotional conversation with my wife, and she was responding with a practical conversation. And those are both totally legitimate conversations. But because they weren't the same kind of conversation at the same moment, it was very hard for us to hear each other. And this has become known since then as the matching principle and in neuroscience and psychology, that you have to have the same conversation at the same moment in order to connect with each other. But that's one of the big insights, is that paying attention to what conversation is occurring and learning to recognize and match others and invite them to match you is really important. That's what makes us a super communicator.
Are people naturally super communicators, or is this something you can learn over time?
Oh, you absolutely can learn it. It's a learned skill. We know this from experiment after experiment, much like reading. Anyone can learn to read and anyone can learn to be a super communicator. And what's interesting is that we are all super communicators at one moment or another because our brains have evolved to be so good at communication. Here's a good example. So if you came home after a long day and you wanted to call someone who you know would just make you feel better, just talking to them, do you know who that person is?
Yeah, there's a couple of them.
Tell me one of them.
Oh, my wife.
So when you're talking to your wife, she's a super communicator for you, and you're probably a super communicator back to her. And you probably do things like you ask each other deep questions, you prove that you're listening, you match each other, the type of conversation you're having, but you also reciprocate vulnerability and authenticity. So we do this very instinctually with a set of people. There are some folks who can do this with literally anyone. They can connect with anyone. And for them, it's not so much that they're special, that they're extroverts, or that they're charming. It's that they simply recognize that what you're doing with your wife is a set of skills that you can use with any other person. The same way that we learn to read by reading nonfiction, that doesn't mean that we can't read fiction or we can't read cookbooks. Reading is a fungible skill. Communication is also a fungible skill. And once you learn the principles of what real communication is, you can use them with anyone. So any of us can become a super communicator.
What are some of those core principles that are super communicators?
One of the big ones is asking questions and asking the right questions. So people who are consistent super communicators, they tend to ask 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person. And I mentioned that some questions matter more than others. And within psychology, these are known as deep questions. And a deep question is something that asks about our values, our beliefs, or our experiences. And that can sound intimidating, but it's actually as simple as if you meet someone and you ask them, where do you live? And they say, oh, I live in the Heights. And you say, why'd you decide to move up there? Or what do you love about that neighborhood? Or you meet someone and you say, oh, what do you do for a living? And they say, I'm a doctor. The most natural question is to say, oh, where do you practice medicine? But if instead you ask, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Those are deep questions because what they do is they invite the other person to talk about their experiences and their values. And they don't seem like overly intimate questions. They don't seem like weird questions to ask. But when we ask deep questions, what it does is it gives someone else a chance to tell us who they really are. And if we listen to what they're saying, we can figure out what mindset they're in, what conversation they want to have. But equally, when we reciprocate that, when we say, oh, that's interesting, you went to medical school because you saw your dad get sick. I actually became a lawyer because my uncle got arrested when I was a kid. When we reciprocate that authenticity, what it does is it makes us feel closer to each other. In fact, it's basically hardwired into our brains. We can't help it. So that's one of the first skills, is asking questions, and in particular, asking deep questions.
What are the next most important skills?
Well, once we've asked those questions, what we need to do is we need to prove that we're listening to the other person. That's why this reciprocation is so important, is because we've all been at the situation where we're at a party and someone asks us a question like, where'd you go on vacation? And we realize within 10 seconds, they don't care where we went on vacation. They just want to tell us where they went on vacation so they can brag about their yacht. So when we reciprocate, when we prove that we're listening by asking follow-up questions, by sharing something about ourselves, in a conflict, there's a method known as looping for understanding that's incredibly powerful. Study after study has shown that it's the best way to resolve a conflict. And it has these 3 steps. Step 1 is you ask a question, preferably a deep question. Step 2 is you repeat back what you heard the person say in your own words. Prove to them that you've been listening to them. And then step 3 is you ask if you got it right, which in a conflict, that 3rd step, which is the one we usually forget, is incredibly powerful because what we're doing when we ask, did I get that right? Is the other person might say, no, you didn't get it right, which is useful to know. More likely, they're going to say, yeah, I think you got it right. And what we're actually doing is we're asking them for permission to acknowledge that we were listening. So the second thing, proving that you're listening, that's really, really powerful and really, really important. And then the 3rd skill is basically just to think a little bit more deeply about the conversation you're having. The goal of a conversation is to connect with the other person. And what we find is that people who are supercommunicators, if you were to ask them, for instance, have you always been good at communication? What they say is no. When I was in high school, I had trouble making friends. So I really had to study how kids talk to each other. Or my parents got divorced and I had to be the peacemaker between them. People who are supercommunicators because at some point they just had to think half an inch deeper about how communication works. And it's that paying attention to how communication works, showing the other person that you want to connect with them. That's the thing that makes us into a supercommunicator.
There's an interesting balance in you're asking a question, you're looping for understanding, but then at the same time, you mentioned reciprocating. There are times where, as you mentioned, someone asking you about where you went on vacation, just so I could tell you where I went on vacation. How do you figure out the balance between what's real reciprocation and what's just talking over someone so you can be talking and not listening?
I think the right way to think about it is, are you trying to expand the spotlight on this person, or are you trying to steal the spotlight for yourself? Reciprocation doesn't always mean talking about yourself. So if someone said to me, last week was really tough because my aunt passed away, the exact wrong way to reciprocate is to say, oh, I understand exactly what you mean. I had a dog that died 7 years ago. It left me a wreck for a month. That doesn't feel like I'm reciprocating or I'm listening. That feels like I'm trying to steal the spotlight. But if I was to say, oh man, I know how hard that can be. Tell me about your aunt. What was she like? That's an act of reciprocation because I'm emoting. I am showing them that I'm listening and that I want to learn more and that I understand that this person was important to them. So there are some times when talking about yourself is really powerful. You became a doctor for this reason. Interesting, I became a lawyer for a similar reason. That doesn't feel like I'm trying to steal the spotlight. It feels like I'm trying to relate to you, to find this thing that we have in common. The truth of the matter is that the question you asked is a tough one because there is no perfect formula that's really easy to apply, except to say what's really important in a conversation is authenticity. So if I'm authentically interested in you, I'm going to know when to reciprocate and how to reciprocate pretty easily. If I'm just looking at the conversation with you as an opportunity to talk about myself, the other person's going to pick up on that almost immediately.
If you take those 3 principles and then apply them back to this 3 types of conversations, someone thinking a little bit more about what's happening in the conversation, you use the example with your wife of someone's sharing something emotionally, you're trying to give a practical solution, and that doesn't go well. When do those other 3 types come into conflict?
Well, they always come into conflict when we're not having the same kind of conversation. So in Supercommunicators in the book, there's a story about Netflix and this controversy that they had at Netflix over race. And one of the things that they found is that when some people came into conversations about race within the company, which was a very polarized conversation, one of the executives had used the N-word in a meeting, and it had just set off this firestorm that lasted for months. Some people came to it as a very practical conversation. Oh, here's where it's appropriate to use the N-word, and here's where it's not appropriate to use the N-word. And other people were coming to the conversation saying, no, this is really emotional for me. When I hear that word, it makes me feel like I don't belong here. It's inherently offensive. There's never a right time to use it. And I think what's important there is it's not like either of those conversations were wrong. It's not like either of those conversations actually had to be in conflict with each other. It's that if two people are having those conversations at the same time with each other, it's almost impossible for them to communicate. Because one person is saying, look, this matters to me as a really emotional issue. It might even be a social conversation. This is about how I relate to the company. This is about the social identities that are important to me. And the other person is saying, oh no, this is just a practical question. It's just a question of what do the rules say about when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate. It feels to both people the other one isn't listening to them. It's not that these conversations come into conflict. It's that if you're not having the same conversation, then conflict can grow very easily.
So how about the social conversation piece? How does that play out?
So a social conversation is when we're talking about how we relate to each other or how other people relate to us or just our social identity. Tell me what you do for a living.
I guess I'm a podcaster at times.
How do you feel about that? Because you haven't been a podcaster your whole career, but now you are a podcaster. When you're at a party and you meet someone and you say, I'm a podcaster, how do they react?
There's a way that eyes light up that they don't if you say you're an investment manager, that's for sure.
Okay. So what's interesting is when I ask you what do you do for a living, you introduce yourself with an identity, a social identity. I'm a podcaster. You could say, I'm an investment manager, but I've been spending more time doing podcasts and X and Y and Z. But the identity of being a podcaster seems important to you because people light up when you tell them it. It seems more interesting to you to be a podcaster than to be an investment manager. So if we continue to this conversation, it would probably be a social conversation because what we're talking about is not necessarily just what the activity of podcasting is like, but how you see yourself in the context of how you spend your time. And I'm certain you went to HBS and I went to HBS. And that's a social identity that's probably important to both of us. It's not the only social identity and it's not the most important one, but we're trying to figure out what overlapping experiences did we have? How do we see ourselves and see the world? What people do we know in common that help us understand who the other person is? Now, these social conversations, as I mentioned, there's this story about Netflix in the book. There's also a story about a CIA officer trying to recruit an asset. These social conversations can feel scary sometimes when we're talking about politics or race or sexual orientation or really any number of things. And they get scary usually when we tend to focus on just one social identity. I had this experience recently. I was in a meeting and one of the guys in the meeting with me was African American and the issue of policing came up. And someone else in the room was like, well, you know, Jim, as a Black man, how do you think about policing? And I was just thinking to myself, poor Jim. He just got pushed into this corner where it's, you're the Black guy in the room. You need to represent all Black voices. And we know that this happens all the time. This happens to us. This happens to other people. So the right way to have these social conversations is to not avoid the fact that Jim is Black and that he probably has different experiences than the rest of us, but rather to acknowledge that all of us contain many, many social identities. We all contain multitudes. So I jumped in and I was like, Jim, I'd love for you to answer that question, but I also know you're an attorney and you probably think about policing as an attorney in a different way. And you're a father. And I know that you coach Little League and we're on a bunch of committees together. You wear all these different hats. Tell us what you think about policing, given the fact that you see it from so many different perspectives. At that moment, what's happening is that Jim is being invited to actually express who he is. We are acknowledging all the different social identities that all of us carry around within ourselves. And when we push someone into a corner and we say, oh, you're just one social identity, you're just the woman in the room or the Black guy in the room or the investment manager in the room, that doesn't feel good. And in fact, we have this automatic instinct to push back. But when we say to someone, you have a bunch of different identities, tell me how those identities mix together to create who you are and how you see the world, that feels like an invitation to be authentic and to say something meaningful.
What are some of the other ways that you've learned as you're entering into a conversation to set the table so that you're more likely to connect with the people engaged in that conversation?
It's a good question. I think I spent a lot of time asking questions. So this is like an interview. This is a little bit different from a conversation because a conversation is really about a back and forth. And if you try and interview someone in a conversation, it can feel like an interrogation. It doesn't feel good. But I think that one of the things I do is I try and ask questions and then I try and listen for what the person is telling me about what conversation they want to have. I mentioned that there's a story about this CIA officer trying to recruit an overseas asset. And he's been trying for months and nothing works. And this woman basically says, I'm never going to work for you. She's completely freaked out talking to him. And then he goes to dinner with her and she's just glum the entire dinner. And he keeps trying to cheer her up. He keeps telling her funny stories or reminiscing about times they went sightseeing together, trying to like get up her emotions. And after a while, he's like, what am I doing? I'm not matching her. I'm basically ignoring everything she's telling me about how glum she feels that she has to go home next week. So instead, what he does is he just becomes honest. And he says, look, you seem down. I feel down too, because I've been here a year and I've not recruited anyone. And I think I'm going to get fired. This is not him trying to manipulate her. This is him being as honest as possible. Just saying, I give up. I'm not going to try and recruit you anymore. I just always wanted to be a member of the CIA. And I finally got this job and I'm terrible at it. And it was at that moment that she heard him for the first time and says, I understand what you're trying to do. And I understand what you're trying to do is similar to what I'm trying to do. And I think we can help each other. And she ends up becoming a CIA asset, one of the best in the Middle East for the next 20 years. It's because he paid attention to actually not only listening to the words coming out of her mouth, but listening what she was trying to tell him about the mindset that she was in. And that's an important thing. Oftentimes, someone comes to us with a problem, and instead of listening to their mindset, instead of listening to what conversation they're having with us, we try and solve their problem, or we try and make it better, or we try and cheer them up. And that's not what they need or what they're asking for. So I've tried to get better at listening to what people actually want.
How long do you think it took as you're doing this research, just for you individually, to go from wherever you were before the research to a place where you feel like you're better at being a super communicator?
Oh, almost immediately. Communication is Homo sapiens' superpower. It's the thing that has allowed our species to succeed far beyond every other species. So as a result, our brains have evolved to be really, really good at communication, and in particular, to build new communication habits very, very quickly. So this thing that I mentioned, looping for understanding, where these 3 steps. The first time you do it, it can feel a little bit awkward. The third time you do it, you don't even notice you're doing it. It's completely natural. Because our brain takes these activities and it makes it into habits very, very quickly. So it does not take a long time to get a lot better at communication once you understand how communication functions. Oftentimes when people are bad at communication, it is not because the skills are hard. It's because they don't understand that there are skills in the first place.
Sometimes when you think about listening and asking questions, you might associate that with someone who's slightly more of an introvert. And I'd love to hear what your favorite story is from the book about someone who bridged both of those.
There's this story about NASA. The basic story is that NASA needed to start choosing astronauts that had more emotional intelligence. And this is actually started in the 1980s because President Reagan came to NASA and he was like, look, I want to build an international space station. You guys should start planning for missions that are 6 months to 12 months. And what NASA discovered is that you don't need much emotional intelligence to do a 10-day mission. And up till then, most of their missions had been 10 days or less. But if you're living in space with other people for 6 months or 12 months, you have to be really good at emotional intelligence because otherwise you're going to drive each other crazy. And so they wanted to try and figure out which astronaut candidates were good at emotional intelligence. The problem was it was really hard for them to do that because by the time you make it to a final round of an astronaut interview, you're amazing. You have a PhD and 3 masters, and you're a fighter pilot, and you're handsome and beautiful. And most importantly, you've been doing interviews your entire life. You know how to fake emotional intelligence as well as anyone on this planet. And they couldn't tell the difference between who was faking emotional intelligence and who actually had it. Until this one psychologist came up with this test, which is he would go into an interview with a stack of papers and he would spill the papers as if by accident. And he would laugh this big uproarious laugh. And then he would pay attention to how the candidate reacted. Because everyone laughed back and everyone offered to help. But some people basically went, that's really silly. Let me help you with that. Sort of embarrassed on his behalf. And other people would laugh this big boisterous laugh and say, let me give you a hand. That's really silly. And it was the people who were matching him that had emotional intelligence. And what's interesting is that when I talked to that psychologist, I asked him, are you an extrovert? Are you someone who this is natural to laugh this big? And he was like, no, actually, I'm shy. He was sort of recluse, a little bit of an interesting, odd guy. But that didn't matter. And I asked him, are the best astronaut candidates, are they people who are extroverts and charming? And he was like, no, actually being an extrovert or introvert and charming, it doesn't matter. What matters is, do you want to connect with the other person? And do you show them that you want to connect with them? That's what emotional intelligence is wanting to connect and showing the person that you want to connect.
I'd love to bridge back to, say, your writing in this book and talk about some of the applications in a business. So you mentioned the Netflix example. How does a company go about addressing any sensitive subject in a way that allows people to communicate with each other?
So I think the first thing you have to do is you have to be really transparent about what the goals of the conversation are and what the conversation is about. If you've had some controversy over race within your company and you come in and you say, well, I don't want to talk about race, but let's just talk about how we feel about each other. Everyone's going to see through that. You need to be upfront, but then you also need to be able to say, look, this conversation is going to be awkward. And that's okay. Actually, the awkwardness is part of the reason why we're having the conversation. And by the way, I'm probably going to say the wrong thing. And I'm going to ask you to forgive me because in the gap between my brain and my lips, something might get screwed up and I might say something in a way that sounds offensive to you. And I apologize in advance. And I promise if you say something offensive to me, I will forgive you for it. I'll let you know. I don't like how you phrase that, but I assume that you're not trying to be offensive. And these two things, acknowledging that the conversation can be difficult, acknowledging in advance that we're probably going to say the wrong thing, those are really, really powerful. And the third most important thing is they emphasize that everyone has a seat at this table and everyone belongs here. One of the things that happens, for instance, around conversations about race is that oftentimes anyone who's white sits back and feels like either they don't have a role or they're worried about saying the wrong thing. And the people who aren't white are suddenly expected to carry the entire conversation, even if they're like, look, this is not something I think about on a regular basis. So what's really important is to say, look, what matters here is that we all have a racial experience. We all have different identities that are influenced by different things. That does not mean that my experience as a white person is going to be the same as the experience of a black or brown person. But we all belong at this table. And the only way that this conversation works is if we're all trying to understand each other. When we do that, when we do these three things, acknowledge it's going to be uncomfortable, acknowledge we're going to make mistakes, acknowledge that everyone belongs at this table, we've oftentimes gotten 90% to the goal of making it safe to have this conversation and allowing people to really share with each other.
How about an oppositional conversation? So you could think about a business negotiation. You could think about one person pitching another, say, investment manager pitching a prospective client. How does it work in those contexts?
So the first thing to figure out is this actually a conversation? Because in a negotiation, it might not be a conversation. In a negotiation, it might be that I want to get you to reveal some information and I'm going to use that information to beat you over the head. So that's not necessarily a conversation. But in most negotiations or in most pitches, it should be a conversation. What we know is that when it becomes a conversation, it's much more successful. And what's really important in those situations is to enter the conversation with the right goal. And the goal is not to win the negotiation. It's not to convince the other person that they're wrong and you're right. It's not even to sell the product. The goal is to understand what the other person is trying to tell you and to speak in such a way that they understand you. Persuasion is a secondary tactic to communication. And unless you get the basic of communication down right, the persuasion is probably not going to work. So I'm sure you've been in this experience where some investment manager comes in and they're like, I got 5 deals for you and they're all amazing. And the client's like, whatever. Versus the great investment manager who comes in and is like, tell me what your goals are. Tell me what you're worried about. Tell me how you see the world. Tell me what you want to know about. And then says, you mentioned that you're worried about inflation. I actually have a product that's pretty good. And that doesn't mean it's perfect. There's pluses and minuses. But if you're worried about inflation, it'll help you hedge against that concern. So I think the idea is if we go in and as our primary goal say, I really want to understand how you see the world. And I want to help you understand how I see the world. And the secondary concern is persuasion. The secondary concern is winning the conversation or selling you the product. You're just going to be much more successful.
How do you think about what you've learned in the context of a Cialdini's influence or the ways that you understand the conversation, but there are these tools anchoring that help you influence somebody else?
I think the Cialdini stuff is really useful and important it's important to know about. The truth is, oftentimes in today's world, we try and look at things like anchoring as this magical thing that if I just anchor at the right place, I'm going to get you to do something that's not in your own self-interest, but is in my interest. That never actually happens. If I walk in to buy a car and they're like, here's a $100,000 car, and then by comparison, here's your car that's only $60,000, I'm not going to be like, oh, that's so cheap. I'm going to be like, $60,000 is still a lot of money. I'm not an idiot. Neither is anyone else. So I think that Cialdini's principles are really important in the context of authentic conversations. Take investment managers. I know that having talked to a number of managers, having friends who are managers, many managers treat the conversation with clients as if it's a practical conversation. Here's 5 solutions to the problem that you have. But for the client, and you know this better than I do, for the client, it's often an emotional conversation. When I talk about money, I'm worried about my future. I have all these anxieties. I feel stupid. I feel like everyone else knows the answer and that I'm behind the curve. So the investment manager can certainly use the Cialdini principles. He can try and nudge you one way or the other. And that's not terrible to be aware of those. But the most important thing is to say, look, this seems like an emotional issue for you. Let's talk about those emotions. Let's talk about what you're anxious about. Because that's going to shape how this conversation should unfold. And that's going to shape what kind of advice I should give you and how I should give you that advice. So I think that it's really important to have the conversation first.
How do you think about delivering bad news? It could be in the business context, a performance review, or just a tough conversation that you know has to happen.
So let's take performance review, because that's a great example. Again, the first question is, do you want this to be a conversation? Or do you want to impart some news to someone and then have the conversation later? Oftentimes when we're doing a performance review, we think that we want to have a conversation, but we actually don't. We want to say, look, here are some problems with your performance. Here's some stuff that you need to work on. But we're not looking for them to justify it. We're not looking for them to explain. We're not trying to understand. We're trying to give them some news that they need. And then down the road, we might have a conversation. We might say, look, I want you to take this home and tomorrow let's get together. And I want to talk through, I want to hear your thoughts on these criticisms or these suggestions and what you think I can be doing better to help you. So the first thing to figure out is, do you want a conversation or do you want to simply deliver some news to someone and have the conversation later? Let's say you do want to have the conversation though. The same principles apply. We need to start this by saying, look, this can be awkward and I might say the wrong thing, but here's my goal. My goal is to help you succeed at this firm. So when I give you this feedback, it is not because I think you're dumb. It is not because I think you're bad at your job. It is because I think that you can succeed here. And here's some input to help you succeed. So let's establish that we have the same goal. You want to be successful at this company. I want you to succeed at this company. Okay, now that we've got that on the table and resolved, now let's figure out what conversation we're going to have. Is this something where, as we're talking about it, you're feeling really defensive, you're feeling really emotional, and we need to talk about those emotions and resolve them before we can talk about practical stuff? Or are you saying, actually, no, this is a practical conversation. I don't know enough about hedging strategy. Where can I go to learn about hedging? Let's figure out what conversation we want to have. And again, if we just acknowledge at the outset, this is going to be an awkward conversation. We're not going to avoid the awkwardness, but our goal is the same. And we can talk through how we should be talking to each other. It's going to go a lot better.
How do you think about bringing that online when so much communication in that context of a business where you are trying to have conversations, but they're coming through the screen instead of face to face?
So I think the key there is just to remind yourself that different kinds of communication have different rules. So certainly giving someone performance review over a text message would be a terrible idea. And all of us know that. We recognize that. And it's not because texting is bad. It's because texting has certain rules associated with it that make it really hard for us to give sensitive feedback that way. One of my favorite examples of this is that about 100 years ago, when telephones first became popular, there were all these papers that said, oh, no one will ever have a real conversation on the telephone. Because up till that point, all conversations had happened face to face. And what's interesting is they were exactly right. If you look at transcripts of early telephone conversations, people didn't know how to use them. They used them as telegrams. They would call up and they would give a grocery order and then hang up right away. People did not know how to have conversations. Now, by the time we were teenagers, we could talk for like 7 hours a night on the telephone, and they were the most meaningful conversations of our lives. And that's because we learned to use telephones. And we actually do things differently on a telephone without realizing it. When you're on a phone, you tend to over-enunciate your words a little bit. Because you almost subconsciously realize that the other person can't see your expressions, you put more emotion in your voice. We do this automatically without even thinking about it. The same thing is true of our online communications. We are learning what the rules are for different forms of communication online. And when we get into trouble is when we don't stop to think about those rules. When we say, I could give you some feedback over a phone call or email or text, right? They're all the same. I'll just text you. You screwed this up. You need to get better at hedging. That's not going to go over well because we're not taking the time to think about what are the rules of this form of communication? What messages can it do well and which messages can it do poorly?
So Charles, you've written this book. I'm really curious how the lessons of supercommunicators have changed how you go about the rest of your work.
Oh, a lot. It used to be as a reporter, I would ask people questions and very infrequently talk about myself. And I think one of the things that I've realized from writing this book is that a conversation is always superior to another form of communication. So I am more open about myself and my experiences and where I come from because I find it helps me create a real genuine connection with other people. And then they're more willing to share about their own experiences and their own values and beliefs. So I think that's part of it. The other thing is that my wife and I just spend a lot of time talking about how to communicate with each other. Because again, just thinking about communication makes you better at it. So when I come home now and I've had a bad day and she'll say, do you want me to help you solve this problem? Or do you just need to vent and complain? And I say, no, I just need to vent and complain. That feels really good.
I want to make sure I have a chance to ask you a couple closing questions. What is your favorite hobby or activity outside of work and family?
Ooh, that's a good question. I really enjoy reading and I surf occasionally. We live in Santa Cruz, California. We moved here in part because I was hoping I could surf a lot and I don't surf a lot. So in theory, surfing, but in practice, reading.
What's one fact that most people don't know about you?
Oh, I have 9 siblings. The only reason most people don't know is because it's very unusual to have large families these days.
And where do you rank in the birth order?
I'm third from the bottom.
What are the implications of that?
I don't know that there are that many implications, to be totally honest with you. It's a big family.
What's your biggest pet peeve?
I have an office downtown and there's this guy who plays music really, really loud outside of my office. That's such a specific pet peeve. I'm not sure it's generally applicable.
Which 2 people have had the biggest impact on your professional life?
First of all, probably my wife, because we both support each other's careers very strongly. I was hired at the New York Times by a guy named Larry Ingrassia. He was a great manager. So probably Larry.
What's the best advice you've ever received?
There's not one thing that ever stands out in my mind as being determinative. I think that actually we're the sum total of the experiences that we have. So I would say that one nice thing is that my father always encouraged me to do work that I enjoy and to assume success. Assume that the financial parts and the lifestyle parts, that they'll work themselves out if you're doing something that you really enjoy. So that's served me pretty well.
All right, Charles, I have one more for you. What life lesson have you learned that you wish you knew a lot earlier in life?
Honestly, a lot of it is around communication. The truth of the matter is that if you can communicate well with other people, if you can show them that you respect them, you're going to avoid 95% of problems. It's when we stop communicating with other people, when they feel disrespected or they feel we don't care about them, that's when suddenly these conflicts become insurmountable. So I wish I had known that a little bit earlier.
Charles, greatly appreciate you sharing this incredible book and your thoughts around it.
Thanks for having me. This has been so much fun.
Thanks for listening to the show. To learn more, hop on our website at capitalallocators.com, where you can join our mailing list, access past shows, learn about our gatherings, and sign up for premium content, including podcast transcripts, my investment portfolio, and a lot more. Have a good one, and see you next time.